The Sterling account. My father didn't just throw me out of the house that night. He threw me out of his life. He looked at me with a cold, jagged disgust that I can still feel in my bones 24 years later. He reached into his leather wallet, pulled out a $50 bill, and threw it into the mud at my feet. He told me to go buy a new name because the Sterling name didn't have room for a girl like me anymore. I didn't beg. I didn't cry. I just picked up that dirty bill, wiped the mud off on my jeans, and told him that one day I would buy his name back from him. He laughed. It was the kind of laugh that assumes it will always be the last word. It wasn't. Now I'm standing in my glass office in Seattle looking at the rain. The city stretches out below me in silver and steel, and I know every data node pulsing beneath it like a second nervous system because I built the infrastructure that tracks it. When the security feed pings at 9:47 in the morning, I don't flinch. I already knew they were coming. Two people are standing at my door. They look older and desperate, wearing expensive coats that can't quite disguise the smell of collapse. But I would know those faces anywhere, even distorted through a wide-angle lens, even softened by 24 years of consequence. My father looks directly into the camera and he says four words that make my blood turn to ice. Not because they frighten me, because they confirm everything I have been quietly, methodically preparing for. Let us see the child. I lean into the intercom. My voice is as calm as a frozen lake and twice as deep. I ask them, with genuine curiosity, what child they are talking about. And before I tell you how the color drained from their faces, I want to pause here. Because this story doesn't start in Seattle, it starts in Columbus, Ohio, in a dining room that smelled like burnt roast and suppressed rage, on a night when the clock on the mantel struck 7 and every tick sounded like a hammer hitting a nail. My name is Sophia, and that night I learned that the people who give you life can be the first ones to take it away. I was 17, I was scared, and I was pregnant. I had spent the entire afternoon rehearsing how to tell them, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the bond of blood would mean something. I had practiced the words in the bathroom mirror. I had considered every version of their reaction and chosen to believe in the best one, because at 17 you still have enough innocence left to manufacture hope from nothing. But when the words finally left my lips, the silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. My father, Gregory, didn't move. He just stared at me as if I were a piece of fruit that had rotted on his expensive walnut table. My mother, Vivian, didn't look at me at all. She just kept folding her napkin over and over until her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on some invisible middle distance where daughters apparently ceased to exist. Gregory finally spoke, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that he reserved for closing arguments and killing conversations. He said I had ruined the Sterling name. He asked if I had any idea what I had done to their standing in the city. He spoke about reputation the way other men speak about God, with absolute reverence and zero compassion. I tried to explain that we would take responsibility. I said I just needed help to finish school. I reached out for Vivian's hand, but she pulled away as if my touch were contagious, as if the situation I was in could somehow transfer to her through skin contact and stain her attendance at the next charity gala. Gregory said I had 10 minutes. He didn't yell. Yelling would have been too human for him. He just reached into his wallet, pulled out that $50 bill, and placed it on the edge of the table like a final invoice. "Take this and leave," he said. "If you walk out that door, you are no longer a Sterling. You are nothing." I looked at Vivian. I was pleading with my eyes for her to say something, anything, a single syllable of resistance or motherhood or basic human recognition. But she stood up, walked to the fireplace, and turned our family photo face down. The soft click of the frame hitting the wood sounded like a casket closing. I remember the rain. It wasn't a drizzle. It was a cold, punishing downpour that soaked through my thin jacket in seconds. I stood on the porch with my hands trembling around the strap of a single trash bag filled with clothes, and I heard the lock click behind me. A sharp final sound that told me the world I had known was gone. I stood there in the mud, staring at that $50 bill in my hand. It was wet. It was the price they had put on my entire life, and it felt, in that moment, like the most honest thing Gregory Sterling had ever said to me. I didn't cry. The rain was doing that for me. I ended up at a bus station 3 miles away, soaked through and shivering, carrying nothing but a garbage bag and a wet piece of currency that represented the sum total of my father's love. I bought a one-way ticket to the farthest destination my $50 could reach, and that destination turned out to be Seattle. I don't know if it was fate or just geography. At the time, it felt like neither. It felt like disappearing. The first weeks are a blur I don't revisit often. Cold concrete, the sharp fluorescent light of a 24-hour diner where a waitress named Dolores let me sit in a corner booth as long as I kept ordering coffee. A park bench that smelled of cedar and mildew, the particular terror of being young and alone and pregnant in a city that doesn't know your name and doesn't particularly want to. That was where I met Wren. She was the owner of a small, clean motel on the eastern edge of the city, a woman with eyes that had seen 1,000 storms and a heart made of something more durable than iron. She found me collapsed in the hallway of her building, clutching my stomach, my face pressed against the industrial carpet. She didn't ask for my ID. She didn't ask for my story. She just wrapped me in a warm blanket, sat me down with a cup of tea, and waited. I told her everything. I told her I was a mistake, a disgrace, a girl with no future and a name that had already been revoked. I told her about the $50 in the mud and the photograph turned face down. I told her about the baby and how terrified I was and how I didn't know what came next. Our Wren looked at me with a steadiness I had never encountered before and said something I would eventually carve into the foundation of my company. She leaned in, her voice quiet and certain, and told me that they hadn't thrown me away. They had lost the privilege of watching me shine. She said that from that moment on, I didn't belong to them. I belonged to the woman I was about to become. That night, for the first time since Columbus, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a secret weapon that hadn't been deployed yet. Building a life from scratch isn't a cinematic montage. It's a slow, grinding war against your own exhaustion, and the enemy has the home field advantage. After Wren took me in, I worked 18 hours a day at her motel. I scrubbed toilets until my hands were raw. I hauled laundry until my back felt like it would snap. I checked guests in at 2 in the morning with a smile I had to consciously reconstruct every single time because smiling was a professional requirement and grief doesn't care about business hours. But every night, when the guests were asleep and the lobby was silent, I sat behind the front desk and opened a battered laptop Wren had given me. I didn't study art or literature. I studied data. I studied the way numbers move, the way they hide, and the way they tell the truth when people are actively lying. I became obsessed with the logic of it. People are messy and emotional and contradictory. However, a database is honest. A database doesn't revoke your name or turn your photograph face down. It just holds what it holds and returns what you ask of it, and I found more comfort in that than I had ever found in a family dinner. A year into my new life, the crushing weight of reality hit me in a charity clinic on a Tuesday afternoon. I lost the baby. The doctor said it was a combination of extreme stress and malnutrition from those first desperate weeks on the street. I remember sitting in that cold room, clutching the small woven cord bracelet Wren had made for me, staring at a poster on the wall about prenatal nutrition that felt, in that moment, like a personal accusation. I didn't cry. My heart had been turned into a block of granite by then, and granite doesn't weep. I didn't have room for grief because I was too busy converting my pain into fuel, and I had discovered in those months that rage burns cleaner and longer than almost anything else, so I burned it. And as the years passed, my talent for data architecture turned into a career, and then into an empire. I founded Elysium Data Systems in a converted warehouse space that I shared with 2 other startups and a persistent smell of old coffee. We didn't just manage information, we hunted it. We built systems that could locate a single corrupted variable inside a billion-line dataset the way a surgeon locates a splinter. We built tools that governments eventually paid for and corporations eventually feared. By the time I was 30, I was a millionaire. By 35, I was the person the giants of industry called when they needed to find the leak, identify the breach, trace the origin of a problem back to the exact timestamp and the exact fingerprint of the person who created it. Data doesn't forgive. That's what made it beautiful. But there was a secret I kept even from Ren during those first 10 years of building. I wasn't just accumulating wealth. I was playing a very long, very quiet game of shadows with my father. Because before Gregory Sterling threw me into the rain, he had done something that most 17-year-olds wouldn't have discovered until it was far too late. He had used my social security number to co-sign on several massive gambling debts and failing business loans, attaching my name to his financial wreckage like an anchor tied around the neck of someone he was planning to drown anyway. He thought he had left me with a weight that would keep me underwater forever. Instead, I spent millions of my own hard-earned money quietly buying up those debts. Every time a collection agency came knocking on his door, they were actually talking to a shell company that I owned. I paid off every cent, not out of love, and not out of residual daughterly obligation, but for a reason far more calculated than either of those things. I wanted to make sure that when the day of reckoning came, there wouldn't be a single thread, not a dollar, not a legal document, not a whisper of a paper trail, linking me to him in any form he could use. I was buying my own freedom, one interest payment at a time. I was clearing the ledger so that when I finally moved, the move would be surgical, clean, undeniable. Meanwhile, the Sterlings were rotting from the inside out. I kept tabs on them with the same detachment a scientist brings to observing a culture in a petri dish. Gregory's real estate company was a hollow shell built on vanity, bad credit, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having been held genuinely accountable for anything. Vivian was still performing the role of Columbus socialite, hosting charity galas with money they didn't actually have, wearing borrowed jewelry to events where everyone was too polite to mention the smell of debt. They were living on borrowed time, and I was the one who owned the clock, which meant I also controlled when it ran out. I thought I had reached the end of the chapter when I paid off the last of Gregory's secret debts. I thought I was done with them. I thought the transaction was complete and the file was closed. But then the news broke about the Wren Foundation. Wren had passed away 14 months before my father showed up at my door. She left everything to me, not as sentiment, not as a parting gesture, but as a mandate. The foundation she established in her final years was designed to support displaced youth, teenagers who had been handed trash bags and $50 bills and told they were nothing. She left a trust valued at just over $40 million, with me named as both executor and primary beneficiary, and she left a letter that I have read so many times the paper has gone soft at the folds. The news coverage was significant. Forbes ran a profile. The Seattle Times called the foundation a quiet revolution. Several national outlets picked up the story, and somewhere in Columbus, Ohio, two people in expensive wool coats read about it over their breakfast and made a decision that they would spend the rest of their lives regretting. The Sterlings saw the dollar signs the way vultures register warmth, instinctively and without shame. They didn't just want a piece of my success. They wanted to reclaim me like a lost asset, like a dormant subsidiary that had somehow appreciated in value while sitting off the books, and they were willing to use the most disgusting lie imaginable to do it. By the time Gregory and Vivian showed up at my door claiming a grandchild existed, my investigator, a former federal forensic accountant named Aldous, had already been working the case for 6 weeks. I hadn't needed the security camera ping to tell me they were coming. I had known for a month and a half. I had been waiting. What I hadn't fully anticipated was the scale of what they had built while I wasn't looking. I let them into the foyer, not out of warmth, not out of any remnant of daughterly instinct, but because the trap needed space to finish setting itself. I poured 2 cups of coffee I had no intention of drinking, and sat across from them in the kind of deliberate silence that makes people fill the air with exactly the information you need. Gregory looked past me into my home with an expression I recognized immediately. It was the same expression he had worn when surveying a property he intended to acquire. Vivian reached out as if to touch my arm, her face arranged into a mask of maternal concern so practiced it had lost all its seams. She told me they had forgiven so much. The gaslighting was so effortless it was almost technically impressive. She said it was time to be a family again. She said a story like this, a reunion, would be so powerful. She said I should think of my son. She said I should think of the Sterling name. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a glossy folder. It was a literal script, prepared by a public relations company called Silverline Media, whose offices I had already quietly mapped, whose financial records Aldous had already begun tracing, and whose senior partners had no idea that the woman they had contracted to manufacture into a narrative was the same woman currently sitting across from their clients with a cup of coffee going cold on the table between them. The folder contained talking points, a proposed timeline for the reveal, suggested interview formats, a photo selection guide. There were notes in the margin about which networks would offer the most favorable framing and how to position the grandson's appearance to maximize what they had actually written down as trust fund sympathy adjacency. Gregory leaned forward then, his steel watch catching the light. He said I owed them. He said they had given me the foundation, the blood, and that I couldn't keep a grandson from his rightful family. I let the silence stretch until they started shifting in their seats. Then I told Gregory he was right. I said families shouldn't have secrets. And then I told them there was a small problem with their plan. There is no child. There never was. The baby I carried died 24 years ago in a charity clinic because I was 17 years old, starving and broken by the two people who were supposed to protect me. I had lost her in a room with a poster about prenatal nutrition on the wall, and I had mourned her alone, without ceremony, without a single person in my family of origin knowing or caring that she was gone. I had carried that grief sealed inside me like a compartmentalized file, encrypted, inaccessible, because opening it would have cost me the only thing I had left, which was forward momentum. The room went so quiet I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. Gregory's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Vivian's hand went to her throat, and I watched them recalibrate in real time, watched their expressions cycle through shock and calculation, and then something that looked almost like exposure, like two people who have been performing a scene suddenly realizing the other actor has a different script entirely. I told them I hadn't invited them in to negotiate. I had invited them in so they could hear the truth before the rest of the world did. I told them they hadn't come for a grandson. They had come for a paycheck. And the Sterling account was officially closed. I didn't give them a chance to recover. In my world, once the breach is detected, you don't wait for an explanation. You contain it. They left without another word. But the silence didn't last. By the next morning, Vivian had already started a whisper campaign through old contacts in Columbus, painting me as a cold-hearted corporate entity who had stolen her own child's legacy. Gregory went further. He leaked a heavily edited photograph to a tabloid, an image taken from a public event 2 years prior, accompanied by a headline designed to imply I was concealing an heir and systematically defrauding the Wren Foundation's intended beneficiaries. I didn't answer a single call. I didn't post a rebuttal. I went back to my office at Elysium, sat at my terminal, and sent Aldous a single message, full authorization. Within 48 hours, the complete picture arrived. Gregory had not simply been greedy, he had been criminal. Using the Sterling Family Trust, a fund that Wren herself had helped him establish decades earlier before he systematically betrayed her confidence, he had funneled $1.2 million into a series of shell companies. The goal was threefold. First, to retain Silverline Media for what their internal documents described as a narrative reclamation campaign. Second, to locate and financially incentivize a private adoption intermediary to produce a child who could be publicly presented as my son. Third, and most critically, to use forged documentation bearing my digital signature to release the Wren Foundation trust funds into a joint account that Gregory controlled. Oh, he needed my authorization as secondary beneficiary to release those funds. Because I hadn't spoken to him in 2 decades, and because he had apparently underestimated the extent to which I had built my entire career around the forensic integrity of digital signatures, he had done the one thing that a data architect never forgives. He had forged my fingerprint. Aldous delivered the full evidence packet on a Thursday, the notary logs, the wire transfer records, a recorded deposition from the adoption intermediary, who had become significantly more cooperative once she understood the federal exposure involved. The digital audit trail from the Sterling Trust, timestamped and annotated, showing exactly when the forgery had been introduced and exactly which device had been used to execute it. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the blue light of the monitor for a long time. This wasn't a family story anymore, it was a forensic audit, and I had been conducting it for 24 years. I spent the rest of that week coordinating with my legal team, not as a victim assembling a defense, but as a commander executing a campaign that had been in planning longer than most of my competitors had been in business. We didn't file a lawsuit. We built a cage, systematically, methodically, with every exit sealed before the door was opened. On Friday afternoon, I received an alert. Silverline Media was holding a private press briefing at a hotel downtown, preparing to release what they were calling an exclusive family reconciliation story. Gregory and Vivian were there, dressed in their finest, flanked by two executives from the PR firm. On the large screen behind them, a soft-focus video played a montage of old family photographs from Columbus, edited to look like a nostalgic dream about a family that had never existed in the form being presented. I was sitting in the back of the room, hidden by shadows and dark glasses, watching from an angle that gave me a clean sightline to the stage and to the emergency exit and to the service corridor that I had already walked twice that morning. Gregory took the microphone. His voice cracked with a theatrical sorrow that would have convinced anyone who didn't know he treated emotion as a negotiating tool. He told the room that his family had spent every day of the last 24 years searching for their daughter. He said they weren't just finding her, they were finding the future of the Sterling legacy. He announced, odd with practiced gravity, that they were there to introduce their grandson to the world. I looked toward the back of the room and gave a single nod. The soft music died. The screen behind my father flickered, then went dark. A murmur moved through the audience. Gregory turned and gestured toward the tech booth with an annoyed flick of his wrist, but the screen didn't return to family photographs. Instead, a black and white security recording from 2003 appeared, grainy and time-stamped, pulled from a notary's office in a city 3 states away. The room watched in absolute silence as a younger Gregory and Vivian sat across from a lawyer. They weren't crying, they were laughing. Gregory reached out and signed a document whose title was clearly legible in the upper right corner of the frame: Relinquishment of Parental Rights and Liability. Then the camera caught the flash of his steel watch as he shook the lawyer's hand, and I watched the current version of that same watch catch the light from the stage as his face went the color of ash. The screen split into 3 sections. On the left, the notary log appeared with the date and both signatures highlighted. In the center, a recorded deposition from the adoption intermediary played, her voice steady and factual as she described the arrangement Gregory had contracted and the payment schedule attached to it. On the right, the digital audit trail from the Sterling Family Trust appeared, showing the $1.2 million transfer, the forged authorization, the offshore destination, and the timestamp that placed the forgery at 11:43 p.m. on a Tuesday night in Gregory's own office. I stood up. I took off my glasses. I walked down the center aisle at the pace of someone who has nowhere urgent to be, because urgency implies uncertainty, and I had none. The crowd parted. I reached the stage and took the microphone from my father's trembling hand. He looked at me with a mixture of terror and a hatred so concentrated it had become almost clarifying. I told the room that data doesn't lie. I said that people do, however, and that they had been watching a demonstration of that principle for the last 14 minutes. I turned to the press, who were by then recording everything with the focused intensity of people who understand they are watching something they will describe for the rest of their careers. I told them that the Sterling name was not a legacy, it was a balance sheet, and the balance sheet showed 24 years of fraud, forgery, abandonment, and the systematic exploitation of a foundation built by a woman who had given everything she had to young people who had been told they were nothing. Vivian tried to step forward then. Her face was a mask of desperation so complete it had collapsed into something unrecognizable. She told me to think of the scandal. She said we could fix it. She said the word family like it still meant something it had never actually meant. I looked at her and felt, for the first time in 24 years, absolutely nothing. No anger, no residual grief, no echo of the girl who had reached for her hand across a dinner table and been recoiled from. Just the quiet, complete satisfaction of a completed audit. I told her I had already fixed it, and I gestured toward the back of the room. 4 federal agents in suits stepped through the doors. As the agents reached the stage and began to read Gregory his rights, he lunged forward. His face was twisted with the particular rage of a man who has spent his entire life operating from a position of unearned authority and is encountering, for the first time, a structure that doesn't recognize it. He told me he had given me life and that I owed him everything. I didn't flinch. I looked at the steel watch on his wrist, the one that had caught the light in our hallway when I was 17, the one that had been in every photograph from Columbus, the one I had seen flash in a black and white security recording from a notary's office in a city he had traveled to specifically to erase me, and I leaned in close enough that only he could hear what I said next. I told him that according to the $50 he had given me in Columbus, I had already paid him back with interest. I told him he was overdrawn, and then I told him I was closing the account. The camera flashes felt like a series of small controlled detonations. I didn't blink. I watched the federal agents lead Gregory and Vivian out through the main doors of the ballroom, my father's expensive wool coat bunched up at the shoulders, making him look smaller than I had ever seen him, like a man drowning in his own tailoring. Vivian was silent now, her face a pale blur behind her hands, the glossy folder from Silverline Media still sitting on the table where she had left it. I didn't stay for the questions. I walked out through the service corridor, the cool concrete walls a welcome relief from the heat of the room. On the legal proceedings moved with the efficiency that comes when the evidence is airtight and the prosecution doesn't have to build a case so much as present one. Gregory was sentenced to 12 years for wire fraud, forgery, and the attempted financial exploitation of a charitable trust. Vivian received a suspended sentence and a civil judgment that effectively liquidated what remained of the Sterling estate. Silverline Media's 2 senior partners resigned within the week, and the firm itself dissolved shortly after, which meant the redemption campaign they had been paid to engineer never aired, never published, and never produced a single frame of the reunion footage they had scripted so carefully. The Sterling name as a commercial and social entity in Columbus ceased to function. I drove out to the coast on a Saturday morning, onto a stretch of the Pacific where the waves hit jagged rocks with a rhythmic cleansing force. The air tasted of salt and old cedar. I stood at the waterline and reached into my pocket and pulled out the $50 bill. It was frayed at the edges. The ink was faded. It was a relic of a transaction I had spent 24 years converting into something unrecognizable. I held it for a moment and felt the weight of it, which was almost nothing. The weight of a piece of paper. The weight of a price someone had assigned to a life they had decided wasn't worth keeping. I let it go. It caught a gust of wind, fluttered for a second like something briefly alive, and then the gray water took it. That night I returned to the motel Wren had left me. I walked into the lobby through the side entrance. I'm the way I had always come in during those early years when I was staff and resident simultaneously, and the smell of fresh linen and lavender greeted me the way places greet you when they have been a safe harbor long enough to become reflex. I sat behind the front desk, the same one, the same angle of lamplight. I opened my laptop, and on the Foundation's website there were 312 new applications from young people who had been handed their own versions of that $50 bill, who had been told they were mistakes, expenses, liabilities, names that didn't fit the family ledger. I spent the next 4 hours reading their stories. I didn't see data points, I didn't see case files or intake numbers or the kind of abstracted human information I processed at Elysium. I saw something I recognized with a specificity that had nothing to do with algorithms. I saw the particular posture of people who have been told what they are worth by the wrong people and who are waiting, perhaps without knowing they are waiting, for someone to offer a different calculation. The woven cord bracelet was still on my wrist, frayed at the edges after all this time, but holding. I thought about Wren, about what she had said in that room all those years ago, about privilege and shine and belonging to the woman you are about to become. I thought about what it meant that she had built a foundation with $40 million and put my name on it, not as a gift, but as a directive. She hadn't left me money. She had left me a mandate with the infrastructure attached. I thought about Gregory standing in a ballroom watching his own signature appear on a screen, and I thought about what it actually means to own something, not the legal version, not the financial version, but the version where ownership is a function of transformation, where the thing you claim is made of the distance between what you were told you were and what you became anyway. My father's name had once been a door that closed in my face. Now it was a case number in a federal database that I had built the architecture for. I looked at the 312 applications on the screen and began writing responses, not form letters, actual responses, because Ren had never sent me a form letter and I understood, in a way that had taken 24 years to fully articulate, that the specific texture of being seen by one person at the exact moment you believe yourself invisible is not replicable at scale. You have to do it one person at a time. You have to mean it every single time. At some point, the sky outside the lobby window shifted from black to the particular dark blue that comes just before dawn, and I kept writing. I didn't think about Gregory. I didn't think about the trial or the sentencing or the photograph in the tabloid or the glossy folder on the table at the Silverline press briefing. I didn't think about the $50 bill somewhere at the bottom of the Pacific, which had probably already traveled farther than my father had ever intended it to go. I thought about the 312 people who had applied to a foundation named after the woman who had found me on the floor of a hallway and decided without any particular reason that I was worth the blanket and the tea and the words. I approved every single application that met the criteria, and then, because the sun was coming up over the water and the city was beginning its particular morning hum, and because I had somewhere to be in 4 hours and a company to run and a foundation to oversee, and a name that I had rebuilt from a $50 bill and a trash bag and a borrowed laptop in the lobby of a motel that now belonged to me, I closed the computer. The bracelet on my wrist caught the first light coming through the window. I left it there. 3 weeks later, Gregory's attorney contacted mine with a single inquiry, transmitted through proper legal channels, stripped of all the language of family and legacy and flesh and blood that had filled the ballroom at the Silverline briefing. It was a financial question, a straightforward one. It asked whether I, as the secondary beneficiary and forensic architect of the evidence that had led to the federal conviction, I intended to make any claim against the remaining assets of the Sterling Family Trust. I had my attorney send back a single line, "The account has been closed." I never heard from them again. But the question I keep returning to, the one I can see flickering in the comments whenever this story surfaces, is not whether I won. The question is what the $50 actually bought. Gregory thought it purchased my absence. I thought for a long time that it had purchased my rage. Ren thought it had purchased my future. But standing in my glass office in Seattle, watching the rain move across the city like data across a grid, I think the answer is simpler and stranger than any of those. That $50 purchased the distance between what I was told I was worth and what I actually became, and I spent every year of the last 24 years converting that distance into infrastructure. The Elysium servers run on it, the foundation is funded by it, and somewhere in a federal correctional facility, Gregory Sterling is wearing a watch that no longer tells him anything useful about what time it is.